This time it's our final roundup review of the Daelim VJF 125 Road Sport. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Daelim's VJF 125 was introduced way back in 2016. It's never been a wildly popular bike in the UK. I think because a lot of people assume that it's Chinese or something, and that tends to put people off. But it's really not. It's actually a Korean machine and is very closely related to Honda's. The engine isn't a development of the CBR 125, it's actually a development of the CBR 250 motor. As such, it's a dual overhead cam, 4 valve per cylinder, fuel injected engine, which puts out a claimed 15 horsepower at 10,800 RPM, which means it sits right on the top of the 125 permissible power ranges. So performance at the top end is pretty good. However, you have to rev the nuts off it really to get the thing moving. You need to be kicking around the 8,000 RPM plus to really get where the meat is. Below that figure it rides along okay, but it really doesn't deliver any acceleration, so you've got to work the gearbox. Another problem here is, although the gearbox is smooth and sweet, it's only got 5 speeds. A 6 or even 7 speeder, given the performance nature of the engine, would have been very useful actually. This means that on country roads like we're on now, you spend a lot of time just riding around in 4th gear and fairly rarely snicking up into top gear. However, once you get on a dual carriageway, snick it into top gear at around 60 and it will sit there merrily all day. And delivers pretty good fuel economy too. You'll certainly get in the 80s to the gallon very comfortably, and usually more to be honest. Vibration is pleasantly low, but there is some buzzing at very high RPM at higher speeds, but it's never really intrudes on the riding quality. The riding position is fairly roomy. This is a surprisingly big bike for a 125, and if you're a 6-footer, I would definitely recommend this as a choice. Many 125s are very cramped if you're over 6 foot. However, if you are like Tom in the 6-foot bracket, he found that this bike fitted in very nicely. It's around the size of a CBR 125, so it's a pretty darn big bike. Now the downside of that is it's pretty heavy, somewhere in the region of 160 kilos once that 15.1 litre fuel tank is full. And that will go an awful long way, well over 200 miles between stops. That means that if a 125 can be a great touring bike, this bike is. It's really conceived as a 125 sports tourer, and it's a job it can do surprisingly well. Tom has used it in journeys all over the country and has included quite a lot of motorway miles and found that the bike performed really well. It will sit at 70 happily all day, although of course it is revving pretty high at that sort of point, and top speed is somewhere just over the 70 mark. I'd estimate around 75. Of course the speedo tells scurrilous lies, so it's difficult to tell exactly how quick you're going. Probably take 5 miles an hour for the top end will be somewhere near the real figure. The controls are fairly basic but work pretty well. There's a digital speedo and an analogue rev counter around the outside, and there's another small LCD which gives things like fuel consumption, that kind of thing. There's no gear position indicator. Whilst some people really like to have those, I don't think it's really a problem. Probably the weakest point of the ergonomics of the bike are the mirrors. These don't adjust very well, and they don't give a particularly good view at the best of times, so they're fairly average, not the worst, but by no means the best. And they vibrate and buzz a bit too, making vision through the mirrors fairly poor at, say, motorway speeds. The seat height is claimed to be a fairly modest 780mm, and even though the bike is really narrow, to me it feels a bit taller than this. Maybe it's just the tyres that we've got fitted. Standard tyres on that subject are 110/70s on the front and 140/60s on the rear. I think we're running something slightly thicker. The suspension is fairly crude, given that it's a 125, but it's not bad. It gives a reasonable ride quality for a 125. I think if you were used to big expensive bikes, you wouldn't find it particularly plush, but it's not a bad ride at all actually. Brakes are adequate but not exciting, but given that this bike doesn't have ABS and that it's designed for learners, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It'll certainly stop you, but if you grab a handful in a panic, don't think it's likely to lock up particularly easily. So which is probably not a bad thing given the intended use of the machine. The chassis is a steel twin spar job. It's not the lightest, but it is rigid, so the whole thing does handle pretty well, and you can chuck it around through corners, right up to the limits of whatever tyres you fitted on it. which is a good thing because given the lack of torque of the bike, you're going to need to carry as much corner speed as you can if you're going to make good time. And it's a bike that is very rewarding if you ride it in that manner. The bike is sort of sold as a sports tourer, and we did mod it up very much in that vein. We fitted a top box and even had panniers on it at one time for some of the longer trips that we did on it. You got a little bit of extra drag with the panniers on, which didn't help performance particularly, but it was still able to maintain motorway speeds if you gave it the berries, of course. Despite the fact the engine got an absolute hammering at times up and down the motorway, it held together very well. There were no major problems with the engine at all. I did do a valve check after several thousand miles on the bike, and the valves were still within tolerance, so clearly the engine is very much up to the job. Another good point for 125 is this bike actually comes with a proper oil filter. A lot of 125s, even from some of the major manufacturers, cannot actually make the same claim, so that's a real bonus point for this bike, I feel. Build quality all round is pretty good, and overall I'd say it's an excellent little 125. And finally, in terms of reliability, many people will be a little bit wary about what is a non-Japanese bike, but reliability has overall been excellent. No major problems with the engine at all, and no major problems with the chassis. The only issue we've had was that the tick over ran really quick for a while. I cleaned the sensor on the top of the inlet manifold, and it was absolutely fine. Presumably it was just bad fuel. But that's the only issue we had with the bike at all. Other than that, it's been plain sailing in the 3 years that we've run it. So on balance, it's been a great bike and a real solid performer. I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.